How's it going, people? It's Anton Jackson. I just finished watching Season 3, Episode 9 of Better Call Saul. This is a really intense episode with a ton of plot development and probably one of the most intense endings of a Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad episode I've seen in a while. I can't wait to break it down scene by scene. Let's do this. So the introduction scene with Jimmy visiting a former client of his from Sandpiper Crossing basically sets up the entire plot development of Jimmy throughout the entire episode. This is a pretty important scene when Jimmy learns that he's going to be entitled to most likely over $1 million of his share of the class action lawsuit, and due to his not so subtle financial troubles he's had in the last couple of episodes, he's very eager to get this money as soon as possible to alleviate the financial burden he's put on Kim. He definitely wants to pull his own weight, and he's definitely trying to figure out how he can get this money as soon as possible. As we learn as the episode develops, the interaction between him and his former client Irene is going to be pretty integral to the plot of this episode, and it's really going to kind of show a somewhat dark and I think nasty side of Jimmy McGill, and someone who's definitely willing to use someone else as almost a pawn in his, world chess game to sort of further his own interests. So it was a pretty interesting episode. It was pretty intense, almost kind of disheartening to see the the using of his client, but it was really important to the development of this episode. It seems like it's really going to be important to the progression of the remainder of the season. One episode left. So in the first scene, the first act, after the introduction scene, we basically see Mike setting up the sort of formal and legal paper trail for him to be an employee of Gustavo Fring. And what's pretty interesting about this scene is we get to see the re-emergence of Lydia Quayle, who perished very dramatically at the hands of ricin poisoning by Walter White. Lydia basically reassured Mike that even though he had some reservations about the legality of the formal, on the books paper trail of him working for Gustavo Fring, she basically put his mind at ease, basically told him he had absolutely nothing to worry about. As we Breaking Bad fans can remember, a Madrigal was originally introduced to us after Walter White killed Gustavo Fring at the end of Season 4 of Breaking Bad, and we learned that Madrigal was definitely the company that Lydia was working for, which more or less was sort of a kind of silent partner in Gustavo Fring's meth empire, and was definitely caught in the crosshairs when the revelation of Gus being this, world-renowned meth dealer came to light. So it was really interesting to see, and pretty cool to see Madrigal, re-emerge in the Better Call Saul timeline. It's like I said, it's awesome when we get to see characters and settings from Breaking Bad re-emerge in Better Call Saul. So again, this is pretty cool. The most interesting and intriguing line to me at the end of the opening scene of the dialogue between Lydia and Mike basically entailed that Mike was kind of surprised that Lydia was going to go through all this work and risk so much just for a common drug dealer. But Lydia then responds to Mike that he doesn't really know who Gustavo Fring really is, that he thinks he's just some sort of drug dealer. It's almost kind of a disparaging and condescending term to call him just a drug dealer. Lydia is basically implying to Mike he does not know the real kind of scope and the power that Gustavo Fring has and the influence he has in this world. So I thought that was a pretty interesting scene. And if we all remember from Breaking Bad in Season 4, I believe it was, when we see the flashback in the Hermanos episode when Hector kills Max, Gus's business partner, Don Eladio kind of bends over to him at the pool when he's kind of at the ground with a gun to his head, and basically tells him the only reason that Max is dead and Gus is alive is that Eladio knows who Gus is, further implying that he was some sort of, high-ranking, member of the, Chilean government or in some capacity like that. And this is also reaffirmed to us at later in Season 4 when Gus goes into the DEA and he talks to Hank about his past in Chile, and Hank is unable to find any records of Gus in Chile. So I'm really hoping, and I think the writers will, in the next season most likely, integrate Gus's past in Chile, his mysterious past, which we really didn't know too much about, and was really kind of just a, a throwaway piece of dialogue originally. So yeah, I'm really hoping the writers are able to incorporate some of the mysterious backstory of Gustavo Fring and Chile in the next seasons of Better Call Saul. I think there are definitely many opportunities and a lot of different areas to go with this plot. So I'm really hoping that Lydia telling Mike that he really doesn't know who Gus is. I'm really hoping this piece of dialogue in this scene is kind of setting us up for that in the seasons moving forward in Better Call Saul. So this episode is basically broken down into more or less 5 distinguishably different plots of all the major characters. As we first see in the introduction scene, we see Jimmy McGill's plot. After that, we're introduced to Mike Ehrmantraut's plot, and this is basically more or less all we see of Mike in this episode. And after this, the 3 other main plot lines which we see throughout this episode are the plot between Howard and Chuck, the plot line of Kim, and finally the plot line between Nacho and Hector and Gustavo Fring. So let's break down the 3 remaining plots, first starting with Chuck and Howard. So it's revealed to us that Chuck and Howard have a meeting with the malpractice insurance people, and it's basically revealed to them, and it's revealed to us, the audience, that the insurance premiums of HHM are going to go through the roof because of the revelation of Chuck's more or less mental breakdown in court during the hearing with Jimmy. And after this, when Chuck basically threatens litigation against the insurance company, and Chuck is very enthusiastic and almost looking forward to kind of pressing forward as a practicing attorney to press charges against his firm, Howard more or less is telling Chuck that he needs to step down. He more or less is kind of telling Chuck, look, you should retire. You clearly don't have the right mental state to be my business partner. At the end of the day, I'm trying to more or less protect the reputation of the firm, and this is just not something that's going to work out for me, is basically how Howard is viewing the situation. This more or less completely insults Chuck. Chuck is immediately taken aback by this, and he's really insulted by Howard's recommendation for him to step down. So more or less, Chuck basically completely rejects this notion that he's gonna retire. It basically just keeps throwing in Howard's face that he's perfectly fine, that he's perfectly, you know, mentally coherent. And later in the episode, it's revealed to us that Chuck is gonna sue Howard. He's going to sue Howard for his share of the firm, and more or less Chuck is willing to kind of destroy the firm. At least he's calling Howard's bluff rather than have to retire. And what really kind of was really interesting about the scene to me was, and if we all remember from the very first episode of Better Call Saul, this is basically the plan which Jimmy is telling Chuck to do in the very first episode. More or less cash himself out of the firm because, you know, his condition was very, very bad at that point. But Chuck didn't want anything to do with that. He wanted to basically keep the firm propped up, and he didn't want everyone to become unemployed. He didn't want to cut the company down. But as we see, almost 3 full seasons later, he's completely changed his position. I really think that this ordeal with Jimmy really changed Chuck just as much as it changed Jimmy. And it was really interesting to see that this plan, which Jimmy originally wanted him to do, Chuck is now willing to, you know, move forward with. He's willing to, you know, put all these people out of business. He's willing to, you know, have all these people lose their jobs. Almost for his own pride and ego. So this is actually a really interesting, you know, plot, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the episodes moving forward with all these plots. I was actually really surprised how many new plots and unconcluded plots were brought into this episode. So it's going to be, I'm really excited to see what happens with this plot between Chuck and Howard moving forward. Basically, the next plot, major plot after this, is Kim's plot involving her Gatwood oil client she got from Kevin through her Mesa Verde contacts. And originally when I saw this scene in the very beginning of the episode, I really didn't think it was going to be that integral of a scene to the plot as a whole. But as we learned from the very end of the episode, this is a pretty important thing that Kim's doing for Gatwood Oil. And definitely the kind of main, I guess, theme we can get here is kind of Kim's, you know, really pushing herself and really more or less overworking herself is really going to catch up with her at the end of this episode, as we all see. So I think that was actually a pretty interesting scene. That was definitely one of the most shocking endings I've seen in a while from the episode of Better Call Saul Breaking Bad. That car accident at the end of the scene was just, I was not expecting it at all. I really was wondering what was going to happen at the end of the episode, because there were only about 4 minutes left when, you know, Kim was just like, you know, preparing to drive away in the car to go to her meeting with the Gatwood Oil client. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens after this. We'll see what happens with Kim moving forward. We'll see if this event is going to shape her and change her personality in the next episode and in Better Call Saul moving forward. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in this plot. The final, and in my opinion, the most important plot that progressed in this episode was the plot between Nacho and Hector Salamanca. As we remember from the previous episodes, Nacho is trying to more or less incapacitate Hector because he doesn't want to get his dad involved in the drug distribution business. And what we learn from this episode is that plan doesn't go 100% according to plan. Because when we see the phone call meeting between Gus's people and Hector, we can probably infer that it was most likely Juan Bolsa on the phone kind of relaying the message of Don Eladio to Hector and Gus. And more or less, the distribution plan of Gus and Hector working together is basically working really well, and this is exactly what Don Eladio wants to do moving forward. But this, of course, I think is hurting the pride and the ego of Hector, who definitely wants his own distribution network and doesn't have to work with Gus Fring. And as we see, Gus obviously doesn't want to do this as well. This is obviously burdening him, and he doesn't want to work with the person who killed his business partner. So after this conversation, Hector basically tells Gus to F off. He's basically implying he's going to go about his own means of distribution, and this is definitely something that Nacho is not too happy about, because he's going to have to basically tell his father about Hector's wish to use his business as a front. What was really interesting at the end of the scene was we see Hector's medical condition seems to be getting worse. So it's more or less looking like the drugs which Hector is taking is slowly working to incapacitate him, but maybe not moving as quickly as Nacho needs them to. And as we see later in this episode with a conversation of Nacho and his father, when it's revealed to him about the necessity to work with Hector, basically the chickens are coming home to roost for Nacho, more or less. So a really important conversation in this episode is a conversation between Nacho and his father. Basically, he tells him everything I mentioned previously about how Hector's going to want to use his business as a front. But as we can remember from the previous episodes, his father's a straight shooter and he wants absolutely nothing to do with this. And he more or less kicks Nacho out of the house. And he's basically very upset with his son getting involved with these people again. He probably had his word that he wasn't going to get mixed up with these people anymore, but of course it seems that Nacho went back to it, and you know, the chickens are coming home to roost. But definitely with this plot, I feel like we kind of have a sort of, you know, Chekhov's gun theme kind of stirring right here, because as we know, these pills were introduced to us in this earlier in this season. So I'm assuming that the payoff is going to happen. I mean, if you have this plot kind of laid forward that these pills are going to incapacitate Hector, I would hope that in the next episode we finally see this plot come full circle. I don't know, it could be quite a plot twist in the last episode when we see what happens to Hector, if anything at all happens to Hector. But I'm really excited to see how this plot progresses in the next episode, and I think whatever happens in the next episode is really going to set us up for Season 4 of Better Call Saul. So the main plot in this episode, the real meat and potatoes, is Jimmy's plot involving the Sandpiper Crossing class action lawsuit settlement. This is a kind of a tough plot to watch. It was almost kind of an emotionally draining plot, I thought, in this episode. And maybe some of the people watching would sympathize with Jimmy, but if you really kind of look deep into what he was doing, he was really using this poor woman to kind of further his own interests. He was really using her as kind of a pawn in his chess game. So I found myself feeling very sad for this woman. You know, someone who just, you know, really didn't want to get involved in this whatsoever. And you know, Jimmy's kind of doing you know, pretty, you know, morally questionable thing here. He's definitely probably not breaking any laws, but that's not really something that concerns Jimmy, as we know. He's definitely one to really push the boundaries of what is legal and what is, you know, morally acceptable. So this plot was pretty interesting, and let's break it down right now. So more or less, Jimmy tells Howard that he wants them to settle the class action lawsuit as quickly as possible. And of course, Howard sees right through his charade and basically says that he knows that Jimmy wants his cut as soon as possible of the 20% of the final class action lawsuit. Based on Jimmy's financial situation, he definitely wants to expedite this settlement as quickly as possible. But what we can infer from the plot is, you know, Jimmy might not get this money for several years. This lawsuit could take years and years. But with the circumstances Jimmy's in, with him not being able to practice law and bring in an income, he needs his money as soon as possible. So more or less, he uses his former client as a to further his own interests and to get this settlement in his own pocket as quickly as possible. So more or less, Jimmy alienates this woman against her friends because she seems to be the sort of, you know, arbiter of the final say of the class action lawsuit, and she basically is more or less the final decider of whether or not the residents of Sandpiper Crossing settle the suit. And more or less, he's able to, you know, make it seem from the other residents that she doesn't have her best interests in heart, and basically kind of alienates her and, you know, makes all the other residents of Sandpiper Crossing despise Irene. So, you know, I thought that was kind of it was a pretty, you know, pretty mean thing for Jimmy to do. He definitely wanted to further his own interests. At the end of the day, I guess, you know, there wasn't too much damage done to Irene. You know, definitely probably hurt her feelings and, you know, hurt her emotionally for a short period of time. But, you know, I guess in the end of the day, I mean, she really, you know, she really trusted Jimmy, and he really kind of took advantage of her. So it was kind of, it was very morally ambiguous scene to watch. If anything, you have to really kind of be upset. At the end of the day, you kind of have to be really upset about Jimmy based on what he did. But you can kind of understand the predicament he was in. He really needs the money, and more or less, he's willing to kind of do whatever he can at all costs stuff to, you know, to further his own interests. It kind of reminded me of Walter White to an extent, who kind of had the mentality that he could do whatever he wants to protect his family. And of course, yeah, at the end of the day, you know, Walter obviously killed a lot of people, and kind of, you know, at worst in this situation, Jimmy probably just, you know, hurt someone's feelings and, you know, put someone through emotional distress. But as we can see, when Jimmy turns into Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad, he definitely, you know, definitely stretches the line of what is morally and socially and legally acceptable. So this episode was, you know, I think it was kind of it was a very subtle episode in the development of Jimmy's character as this sort of, you know, malicious and sort of, you know, self-serving person who he's going to become in Breaking Bad. So yeah, at the end of the day, I really think this was one of the most subtly, morally ambiguous episodes I've ever seen of Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. At the end of the day, I mean, the show's main plot is about dealing meth, so the whole kind of, you know, theme of the whole series is more or less morally ambiguous. But again, I really thought it was kind of weird. I felt myself personally, only speaking for myself, like kind of sympathizing, you know, with Jimmy and McGill, but also kind of saying, wow, he's really using this woman. He's really kind of putting this woman down. She's kind of just caught in the crossfire of what he wants to achieve in life. And it was really similar to kind of what we saw in Breaking Bad, where, you know, Walt, you know, did everything he could to further his own interests, and he truly loved his own family, much like, I guess, you know, Jimmy loves really the only family he has, which is more or less kind of Kim in this situation. But of course, you know, Walter White, you know, he hurt and killed a lot of people to support his own family, just like Jimmy's trying to support Kim in this situation with this, you know, $1 million settlement. So at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next episode after this car crash. It's, you know, quite a cliffhanger. It's one of the biggest cliffhangers we've seen in Better Call Saul in quite a while. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the last episode. As I mentioned earlier in this review, a lot of plots were not, you know, were not concluded in this episode. We don't know what's going to happen with Howard and Chuck. We don't know what's going to happen with Nacho and Hector and Gus. We don't know what's going to happen between Jimmy and Kim. So it's going to be really interesting to see if they decide to cram all this into the last episode this season, or if they're going to be even more cliffhangers in the season finale, and we're going to have to wait an entire year to see the revelations of these plots concluded. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. My name's Anton Jackson. There's only one episode left this season. It looks like it's going to be a really interesting, wild, exciting finish. I can't wait to see what happens. I'll see you guys next week.